Well, I'm now joined by Michael Abrams, who's a partner in Finsbury Communications, who works on many clients around the globe and specialises in the retail sector. Michael, thanks very much indeed. When the news was announced, the share prices of a lot of American traditional retailers dropped dramatically. Was that unfair, or was it a just reaction by scared investors?
Well, look, I think share prices are built on research, but they're also built on expectations and emotions. And the fact of the matter is, we won't know for some time whether these decisions overvaluate the worth of the companies or not. It's going to be very interesting to see. But clearly, the expectation environment has changed significantly, and that's creating some reputational issues for clients and for companies in the retail sector.
Now, what do you expect the competitive reaction to be to the news? I mean, do you see retailers tearing up their 5-year plans and starting again, or is it business as usual?
I think every company's response is going to be unique. It'll be interesting to see what else, what other shoes there are to drop in the industry. If we see other retailers jump into the fray vis-a-vis Amazon, or vis-a-vis specifically Whole Foods. If we see private equity start to move in and see an opportunity as well. But I think particularly if stock prices for some of the major food retailers and some of the other retailers stay low, as you pointed out a minute ago, they've dropped significantly in some cases over the last couple of weeks, although those values have started to creep back up again. But if those continue to stay low, it'll be interesting to see if you start to see more people moving into a consolidation mode, into an acquisition mode in the industry. How real those deals might ultimately be with Whole Foods, we'll have to see, but it's going to be very interesting to monitor that.
Now, do you see any other competitors throwing their hat into the ring for Whole Foods, even if it's just to bid up the price so that Amazon has to pay more for it?
Well, there's certainly speculation out there. I think it's it's still too early to tell. I know the speculation early on was that you could see other retailers jumping in, you could see private equity jumping in. I think as the days have passed, some of the speculation has been that perhaps you won't see as active a market for Whole Foods as one might have thought at the very beginning of this process. But again, I think it's going to be interesting to watch this play out over the next few days and weeks.
Now, Amazon is the retailer that other retailers love to hate. Do you see retailers combining together in their reaction to this proposed takeover in order to lobby the government?
Again, I think a bit too early to tell. Certainly, I think you're going to have some in the retail sector who are not obviously thrilled with the prospect of this different kind of competition. And you could I could certainly envision a situation where you start to see retailers putting pressure on Amazon and others in the business community putting pressure on Amazon. You could also envision a situation where Amazon just continues to increase the pressure on retailers. So I think this could certainly go both ways, but another one that is going to be very interesting. We're still in the early, in sort of the early days of this proposed deal being out there, and again, it's just a proposed deal at this point. But it's still early days. I think it'll be interesting to see how this progresses with Amazon and Whole Foods and with the rest of the players in the industry over the next few weeks.
To what extent do you see other retailers now accelerating their digital strategy and trying to make the best of the digital assets and the physical assets that they have? Because I think traditional thinking really was that they could add virtual capacity at a much faster rate than a virtual retailer could add physical capacity, and therefore they could take their time to do this. Have the games changed in that respect?
Well, I think the expectations have changed, and it's changed the context for the conversation that retailers are finding themselves in right now. I know there's a question about the dichotomy that you laid out versus digital growth versus the actual growth of physical space, and whether or not that's redundant. I'm not sure it's redundant. I'm also not sure it's entirely accurate. And again, it's going to be interesting to see how this situation develops, and if the Amazon Whole Foods deal moves forward, what Amazon ends up doing with the Whole Foods property, not necessarily the physical property, although that would be an interesting question, but bringing that brand and integrating it into the Amazon world. I think what's interesting to think about here is, in many respects, Amazon's become a very successful retailer, but I know there's also been commentary on this over the last couple of days. More than being a retailer, it's really a service provider, and it certainly has had a huge impact in the book industry in a very disruptive way. I think it's going to be, there'll be careful watching going on about what Amazon ends up, how Amazon ends up building this business. That there clearly is a play to go for scale, and if they really see themselves, in addition to being a retailer, to being a true service provider, ultimately to a wider spectrum of retail companies, and if they can actually effectively build that scale, perhaps starting first with Whole Foods, building that scale in food retail and then potentially other areas of retail, I think there could be some interesting challenges for retailers all over the world to begin to think about. But again, it'll bear close watching.
Now we're about to enter the quarterly results period for a lot of retailers. What's the mood music around it going to be in relation to both expectations and concerns about what an Amazon Whole Foods combination is going to mean for the industry and therefore for future earnings and shareholder growth?
Well, I think it's a great question, and I think for retailers around the world, it's a key question right now, a very immediate question for them. And there are three issues that really jump to mind for me. One is that the expectations, as we talked about a few minutes ago, the expectations have changed, and the expectations of tomorrow really are here today. Disruptive innovation, disruption across the industry has been hovering over retail for years and years. But what I think until recently looked to be hypothetical is now from a reputation, from a perception standpoint, starting to look imminent, and that's completely changing the context that retailers find themselves having to have a conversation with the media, with investors, and with their employees right now. There's certainly, retailers and their leaders are certainly going to be in a situation, particularly as quarterly earnings heat up over the next month or so, to really answer some questions and really put their position out there about how they intend to compete in this new environment, to deal with at least the perceived potential new work from Amazon in the food retail sector, and what that means given Amazon's rich history of really advanced innovation, deep pockets, and a willingness to spend without a particular focus on generating near-term profits, which is obviously very different from much of the rest of the retail industry. Number two, I think it's going to increase calls for consolidation in the industry. That's something that we've seen happen. We've seen much more consolidation happen in food retail over the last couple of years. But I think as investors in particular start to look at, where is the industry, what do the prospects look like, and what is the industry going to look like a few years down the line, if there starts to be a bigger concern that companies are going to have to get bigger to really compete, not just with the Walmarts and other targets they had been thinking about, but now a very different potential play from Amazon and others. Will companies have to get bigger to really compete on price, on service, on really nailing that customer proposition and what the customer needs today, as well as what that customer is going to need tomorrow. And then third, on a separate front, I think it's increasingly, I think the Amazon Whole Foods proposal, the proposed deal, is going to really holds the potential to really create distraction for employees at many of the food retailers. I know many of the companies have spent the last couple of years really fine-tuning, sharpening their business strategies and working with their employees to make sure that they understood it, that they were well prepared to execute for that customer proposition they need to deliver today, and the customer proposition they're going to have to move towards over the next several years. This additional, for lack of a better term, noise in the industry really holds the potential to create some distraction for what it means for me as a frontline employee, for anybody working in the business. And I think on a related note, all the conversations about particularly around Amazon and its potential work with Whole Foods, discussions about automation and artificial intelligence and how that might affect not just how retail services are delivered, but the jobs that go along with that, holds the potential to lead to some very, very challenging conversations with unions and works councils around the world.
So finally, Michael, what is a retail CEO going to have to do and say to keep the street at bay from those three factors that you so eloquently told us about?
Well, I think I think now is the time to really focus on making sure that they're developing, if they haven't developed it already, and then really credibly delivering a compelling story about their own journey, about their own plans, about their own operations and results, and making sure they're really staying focused on running great operations, but at the same time painting a picture of where what the right route is for their particular company in the future. There may be ways to also, contrast that with what Amazon might be doing with Whole Foods and what the rationale is behind that deal, but to really articulate their own unique business strategy, the one that works and they are comfortable will work extremely well for them and their customer base, and deliver for their investors and shareholders where that's appropriate. But it's really, I think, a question of making sure that the companies have that narrative set. They know how to. They have their story that they're confident in, and that they're confident will be very credible with the people who.
Well, Michael Abrams, Michael Abrams, partner of Finsbury, thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.